Hello, everyone. Welcome. We'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome to the Poetry of Process, Rituals, and Subversions panel. I have the honor of introducing our two poets today. So we have Willa Schneberg, right? Did I say that right? Okay. Willa is a poet, ceramic sculptor, interdisciplinary artist, curator, and a licensed clinical social worker in private practice. The Naked Room, her sixth poetry collection, is a true synthesis of her life as a psychotherapist and her life as a poet. She received the Oregon Book Award for Poetry. And then we have Jessica E. Johnson. Jessica writes poetry, nonfiction, and things in between, an Oregon Literary Fellowship recipient and Oregon Book Award finalist for In Absolutes We Seek Each Other. She is the author of the book-length poem Metabolics, a study in the ecologies of contemporary parenting that borrows the language of metabolic pathways to construct an allegory about a family in the Pacific Northwest. And she lives in Portland. Let's give it up for our poets today. So I thought we'd start off with a reading from both of y'all and then open it up for questions and discussion. So whoever wants to go first.
Wants me to go first? It's a pleasure to be here. I was here maybe 15 years ago, and it was in a very different venue. For those of you, it was a while ago. I remember that same beautiful light and, pretty wonderful having the sun so vividly here today. And I'm really happy to be able to be here again. So what I thought I would give you is a little overview of my book, The Naked Room. And The Naked Room, basically, is how I conceived it, is the room where when you come into the office of a therapist, you feel you can be totally emotionally naked. You can say whatever you need to say. And for those of you who know Oregon at all, do you know Salem, Oregon? Any of you? Okay. Well, I'll start by asking you some questions. Do you know where One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was filmed? Anybody? Oregon State Hospital. And now there is a museum there, and part of that museum is talks about Jack Nicholson in that film, and the cover, it basically are canisters. These are of a memorial at the museum to the cremains of people who were hospitalized in about a 30-year period, and they were folks who died there, and their ashes were never recovered. And many years later, this wonderful photographer, David Mizell, was told about these canisters that were becoming corroded, but basically they oxidized in this beautiful blue. And he showed that they were just in some underground vault. And because of him, those canisters of now, this memorial is honoring those people who lived and died at Oregon State Hospital, and many family members were united with the cremains. So that's what the cover is. So I'm going to read a little bit of giving you an overview. And just to say that my work, I conceive it as a book, and often there's a chronological theme, but it's also larger than that. It's not just about my own life. It's about some of the strange and dangerous cures that have been, like lobotomies, for example, are in this book. And so the section headings relate to terms that would be used by psychotherapists. Like, okay, so everyone knows what asylum is. It's not the refugee asylum. It's the institution, right? Case history is what people often take at the beginning of a session, so you get a sense of a person's life. That's in much more formal settings. Straitjacket, everyone knows what a straitjacket is, and this is the poem I'm going to read is in the voice of a literal straitjacket, but that section is larger. It's about straitjackets that a person might experience in a more visceral level. 50-minute hour is, the typical therapeutic hour, and in New York it's 45, of course. And reality testing is basically, they would ask you, like, do you know what year it is? Do you know what, do you know who you are? You know who the president is? So there's a section relating to what I would call, in general, psychosis. And the last section is called termination. And it's a terrible term. I have no idea how I think of the Terminator, how that became the term as you're finishing your therapy experience. It's called terminating. So all the poems in that section relate to literal death and dying or the end of relationships, but it's about the sense of ending. So I will start with a poem from the asylum section. And how long would you like us to read for, would you say? Well,
Just read the whole damn book.
Yeah, right. No, I don't think so.
I mean, I think 15 minutes is great.
Okay.
We can kind of, there's no rules here. We
Okay.
can do whatever we want.
I just wanted to get a sense of what you prefer. Okay, the first poem is entitled Yellow Halo. And the epigraph reads, Bloomingdale Asylum, New York, 1846. And this is in the voice, I often write the persona poem in a voice of someone other than myself. The I is not close to the poet, as we would know with the confessional poets. Yellow halo. I plead, and they answer crooked, especially Superintendent Pliny Earl. I birth curiosities so unique and wondrous that they belong in the Peel Museum next to fossilized mastodon teeth and the prong-horned antelope. One at a time in my mind, I hold a marvel just so until it emerges through a slit in my back that opens and closes and disappears when God whispers. Conical shells, nails, shank bones, horseshoes, passbooks from Nick Biddle's bank, brass doorknobs slide out, and wasps exit and circle above my head. They are my halo. Wear yellow jackets and are tender. Although free to roam, they choose to dwell in this cell with me and no longer habit their hate sting. Against the attendants, they are my shield, whose voices are thunder, fingers lightning bolts, forged to strike my forceps marked face. And then I'm going to read one more from that section. Sometimes I use the found poem. So it'd be kind of like a photographer who puts a frame around it, and that's the picture. As you probably know, the famous toilet that Duchamp, basically Armut, then it was a sculpture. So I think poets do that sometime. In this case, I wanted to share this poem because it was on the museum board at the Oregon State Hospital. And it's entitled, Admission Criteria for Oregon State Insane Asylum, 1906. So this is what could get you into the hospital then, right? Brain softening, child bed fever, Christian Science, disappointment in love, general debility, which is just like physical weakness, usually a result of an illness, idiocy, lead poisoning, masturbation, menopause, nervous prostration, overstudy. I thought that was particularly weird. Puerperal trouble. Does anyone know what that might be? Puerperal trouble? I think, after, I had to look it up to really, I think it's probably postpartum depression, and they didn't really have a word for that yet, but I think that's what that relates to. The time after you give birth to a child is the puerperal time. Removal of ovaries, spiritualism, suppressed eruption. I bet you can figure that one out, the guys in the room particularly, what that might mean. Tobacco, and the last one is worry. Things have changed, 1906. At that time, of course, a husband who was not feeling like he was getting his conjugal rights could also commit his wife. Okay, so the next section is called Case History. And I'm going to read a poem called Sleeping Beauty. Sleeping Beauty. In the basement where you now hide, a peck on the cheek will not rouse you. You imagine others pricked by sorrow, slumbering too, each in her own bed with blinds drawn, frost on their eyebrows. Above you, toilets flush, yellow, tea kettles whistle, daffodils happily wither in jelly jars. It seems only your windows have bars. So the next one is the straitjacket section, and that's obviously literally and figuratively. So I think what's interesting about the persona poem, of course, is especially when you use it for an inanimate object, then you also are employing personification. So I think you'll get a sense of the creepiness of this straitjacket. Love. A straitjacket speaks. I wrap my canvas arms around you, perhaps a little too tightly. You stop struggling. Your breathing quiets. Inside my narrow kimono-like sleeves, your arms are nicely crossed and contained. I hug your chest and shoulders and imagine you in a coffin lined with red satin, a perfect white camellia covering east eyelid. I'm kind. I don't let them employ the crotch strap. You walk freely around the grounds. Although I never want to let you go, don't they wrest me from you? And doesn't the blood always rush back into your hands? You know the routine. They will release you. Give you a spoon. You'll eat porridge. And the next is the 50-minute hour. And this is trying to get inside the experience of a therapist, what that's like in a day-to-day basis. And as you probably know, any of you have been in therapy or any of you read about therapy, there's something called confidentiality. Hugely important. Why? Because you want to feel, again, when I said the naked room, you want to feel like you are totally safe and there's nothing, anything you say stays in that room. Okay. Confidentiality. You carry their angst with you. a basket filled with quivering raw eggs. Clients must never know your fear of cracking. You must embody what they barely tell themselves. They are the man who shaves the right side of his face first instead of the left. For him, that's the improper order. And must scrape the left side again until it bleeds. The woman who cries diabetes makes her husband slur and unsteady as a drunk, but refuses to be his nursemaid. The young man who says he understands why his girlfriend likes girls, so does he. But since the threesome, he fears she might really like girls more. The wife of the sex addict who hates all the women in his computer and the whores not virtual, and prays her breast implants will win him back. The senior who finally accepts his marriage is over, although he rescued his much younger wife from a cult and now believes he was no hero, just another master. The mother who doesn't want her college-age son to move back if he smokes pot. This week, no talk of the alcoholic paramour who's got to go. Today, one exits, one walks in. The 2 o'clock will never know the grief of the client before her, whose twin embryos clotted out of her body. And, sorry, changing the page, and the 1 o'clock won't feel even worse, not knowing that the 2 o'clock who never wanted children is elated since her abortion went without a hitch. For you, it's like holding a dragonfly by its wings, trying not to tear them off. And I'm going to end with a poem from the termination section. And this poem was a homage, an elegy to a friend, a fellow poet, who died of brain cancer way too soon. I had the pleasure, the bittersweet pleasure of reading her book. She saw her pre-publication copy, and then I read with her editor from her book, wishing that, of course, she was reading from her own book. Italian Plums for Sarah Lance. We climb up lichen-encrusted limbs to pluck purple black fruit, protected with white powder that hides their sheen. We are inundated with plums, burdened by bounty. Why do we merit this small happiness? Plums boiling down in the big stainless steel pot, mason jars brimming with jam, brown paper bags bulging with enough for everyone. If only the plethora of plums could bring you back. But their days are even shorter than yours. They have burst their skins and are staining pavement. You were alive, but are no longer, and will not savor the juice of even one small plum. Thank you.
Yep. Oh, there it is. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So I'm going to read from Metabolics. It's a book-length poem. It's prose poems. And I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning, a little bit from the middle, and a little bit from the end. And the poems are in sections. The sections have titles. And you should, the speaker in this book is me-ish, but not exactly me. And you should feel free to laugh. Sometimes I'm mocking her a little bit, so you feel free to chuckle. I'm going to start in the section titled Of Daylight Saving Time, My Fitness Pal, and Indoor-Outdoor Cats. And, okay. The page turning is going to be a little tricky, but I'm going to figure it out. Home. Before the day starts, birds eat away at silence. Their twitter nibbles darkness into lace. The printer hums because you didn't think to turn it off. The devices eat electrons and electrons and electrons, which come from a spilled river, which come from a coal fire. And the river spills salmon bodies, and the coal fire blooms heat, and the devices yield heat, and the cherry trees swell early, and the summer kills. Outlets wait for the prongs of devices. Cat wears her only clothes. Touch cat, and she chirps. Touch, chirp, touch, chirp. The regular life eats money. The cars eat money. Each device needs its own cover. Each life in your home, in fact, needs coverage. And money eats time. And even before the day starts, well before the sky erupts in birdsong. Cat. The beloved specimen, the invasive species, cat, the little piece of midnight velvet, attaches briefly to carpet, storing up energy, her characteristic throat music, the sound that first endeared you to her, that persuaded you to choose her, to feed and warm and watch over her furred body with its bits of sharp despite. Cat, too, charging. Despite so many attempts to resolve this tension, sometimes you are you and sometimes mother, just as light can be both particle and wave. A person sometimes, other times a role, and no one can locate you at any particular time on that continuum of you and mother. At best, the observers, you, the self-observer, could assign a probability. Mother's precursor is girl. Or at least that's what they called you, a half-naked, self-decorating body, dirt-smeared, making songs from anything. Girl, a kind of song being. Mother was a girl who never saw a long-needled pine, a street-side locust, a groomed red maple without wanting to inhabit it, wanting to wave just like it, wanting to glow just like it, wanting a shape just like it. And what shapes can you inhabit now when the cat, the children keep homing to your body, when they take some special kind of respite in your warmth? You inhale the boy's fresh hairline, brush your lips against the girl's right ear. The cedar's lower story fills the home office window. In mental reactions, cedar catalyzes language, ante, ruffled, feathers, wind combs the white sky. Wind plus cedars equals the motion of ghosts outside the bedroom window, the sway putting the children to sleep. The children dreamed in utero, or so you've read, blind bulbs startling in response to images they could only have inherited. And you, cedars dancing, finger fronds, take up your ambition in the night, and you wake as an inert gas, not reacting to children or the ping-ing devices. Imagine you and the cedar arrange a psychic trade. You as she, and she as you. She wakes at 1, resting her head on the dark sky pillow. You shed your inner soldier and feel the spread of your roots, your rising fluids. The cedar turns over a stupid thing she said at work, remembers moments when she may have offended someone. You may live to be 1,000 years old, dry spells and fire notwithstanding. Cedar considers all the ways in which she's not enough, how her 100 feet aren't tall enough to make a home. Cedar tries coming up with ways of being better, being someone else, being something else, and you close your leaf pores to the cooler air, host a grand reaction, your body restoring itself from stored up light. Morning, pores close, the exchange over, run hands along your thick red bark. Flood of daylight produces the cat coming in from murder. It's the end of that section. The next one I'm going to read is called Of Cloudland, of Plastic Land. Cloudland is Portland, and it's interesting to see what happens when I read this one outside of Portland. In Chicago, they didn't think it was funny. In San Francisco, they did. So, we'll see what happens here. Figure. Two things about here. Heavy cloud covers us 222 days a year. On graphs, the population line rises skyward. Figure. Fog consumes the treetops, takes them swimming in itself. A cloud lake touches down. Here in beautiful, sought-after cloudland, the city is a known utopia of street trees, an invisible map of circular havens, a spectacular keeping out of, a series of awkward moments. The city eats the sensation of belonging and sells it back in the form of handcrafted, in the form of kombucha, in the form of zoning, in the form of programs, in the form of bike paths, in the form of curated produce. Funny, still cracking myself up. The boy, the girl produce war games, swordplay, and songs against each other's bodies. Each wants the most of what there is. Each carries a blanket ready to cover the other's hurt, each ready to wrap the other in arms. They break the forest and cradle its debris. The boy and girl find mother, ask for mother, find her cheek, her neck. All this together pools. The cat, the dog arrive, sensing together, find mother taken up. The cat, the dog adhere to one another, watching. Cloudland fails to curate its plastic. Pages eat ink and pens used up leave plastic husks. Nothing digests plastic. Activity throws off small acts of plastic. Our clothing sheds filaments of plastic. Seabirds take up plastic. Whales take up plastic. People try quitting plastic for 1 month and say it's very hard. We all take up plastic and live. And skipping to the end. Of knowledge, the vast provisional body. On a weekend in full daylight, you crave the compounds released by decomp. You rest your padded bones on damp ground on so many fragments of cedar, while the boy, the girl embark on challenges, climbing hills and fallen logs, teaching their bodies the shape of mountains. The feed proclaims, a single session of exercise alters 9,815 molecules in our blood. The pathways turn and we unlock ourselves. Your eyes adjust and stars come out, even in this cloud land, this plastic land, this place of flexing hegemonies. You receive information not like posts in a feed, but like compounds washed up against delicate root hairs after rain, like CO2 wafting into an open leaf pore. Say one night after they're in bed, the fridge humming, you open up the screen door and step out. You full of night, night full of you. You listen to ferns whose roots store water. You listen to salal whose leaves lose little water, whose body paints the shape of flame, whose berries hang right here. The super/blood/wolf moon now risen. Like the moon, you have stopped counting what you feed yourself, the slice of apple in your mouth and gone before you realized you were holding the knife. Body feels the day coursing through it, needs movement to consume pools of worry. Body walks itself into feeling different. Body decorates itself, paints its awnings, hangs rings on its unimportant skin. Body rests itself, tumbles into its sleep time projection room. Body grown inside another body, body surviving on the bones of other bodies, body living because other bodies are consumable, body into its own bullshit all day, body doing what it did the day before, body with cat, body with children, body taking up cosmetic attention, body inhaling the product of burnt plants, body inhaling the product of respiring plants, body in motion, metabolizing rage. Whose body having to say I?
So much for that wonderful reading. So I have some questions, but I wanted to open it up to the audience first, if anybody has burning desires to ask anything. Yeah. Yeah, we use mics in this house.
I was just wondering where both of you would say you get your inspiration, just kind of in general, I guess.
Is inspiration thinking about, like, we can think of that in so many ways. A big one is from reading, right? Reading the work of other writers is huge. Especially with poetry, language is something you kind of feel and hear in your body. And once you're feeling and hearing it, probably from reading and from hearing other people read, you know, it comes to you. I'm also a super visually inspired writer. So what I see, I want to make sense of, and I want to sort of, I don't know, I want to do art with it. I want to do something with it. And I think, and for me, that often comes from just the details of daily life. And for me, I'm a teacher, community college full-time. And so part of my daily life is what I read of my students' writing and what we talk about together and what we experience together. That's a big part of my just daily reality.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Sometimes something just, you can say, what's inspiration? Something just speaks to you, right? And I think my last few books I have conceived as linked poems, so poems in relationship to each other. And part of my, I would say, influence has always been research. So that could be through reading a book, that could be through an article. Just the other day, there was an article about that blind people have a special relationship with birdsong. That just spoke to me. That is fascinating. I want to research that. I want to understand that. So sometimes what intrigues us doesn't become a poem, but sometimes it's sort of in there. And slowly we understand that, wait a minute, this is starting. And I think that's the kind of magic part, you're entering that zone. You know, somehow, okay, now you're moving it from something that is intriguing to something that you can turn into language, into art. And so, and I think because my poetry tends to be narrative, and it tends to be, I'm interested in just people's lives. So sometimes it's just a story I've heard. In the 90s, I worked in Cambodia, and so having that experience of people who survived the killing fields, it wasn't enough for me to be writing about the time I was there. I wanted to have a sense of that whole history, you know, from the mythic time to the French colonial period to the killing fields to the time I was there with the UN. So I think it's just really interesting how inspiration strikes a person.
Any other questions? Yeah, you got one?
I do. I was reading the title of this session, and the poetry of process, rituals and subversions. I don't know that I completely understand what that means as associated with your poetry. Do you have processes and rituals that you use when you approach trying to be creative? I just thought I would try to get a little better understanding.
You have your own, I have mine, yeah. Well, I think there's certain rituals that keep me centered. You know, I have a meditation practice, I have a yoga practice. You know, I don't necessarily do it at the same time every day, but when I can center myself with that, it's, I'm more likely to be present and more able to take the muse in. I think in this book, you know, I'm also talking about the other side of rituals, rituals that are compulsive, rituals that work against people. I think there's, you know, we need structure, we need practices, rituals. But some of them are also like somebody who has OCD, who really has to touch something to go somewhere, slows them down, right? It's not necessarily a ritual that we want to have. But in Subversions, part of what I was trying to get out with that title was that subverting the paradigm, that certainly in mental health history, what was seen as normal when I read you 1906, how you could get committed, we now see as horrific. Really? You know, so I think it's also about subverting the paradigm. And, you know, I have a poem in the voice of Kennedy's sister, if you know that she actually received a lobotomy. They thought that she was, you know, there's a lot of theories, but some that she was not acting properly and that could affect her brother's career. That's, again, there's many different biographers who have many different theories. But the truth is she did have a lobotomy, and it was the treatment of the time. She had one of the early lobotomies. And Muniz, who was actually Portuguese, he invented the lobotomy, and he received a Nobel Prize in 1949 in science. So we know, and that's what I'm talking about, subversions, that the fact is that maybe the generation of us today, what seems normalized, maybe psychotropic meds, will see that very differently. You know, just like there's still straitjackets, but they're more chemical now.
I want to just say that Willa and I did not pitch the session title. We received it. So that's one thing you may want to know. But I liked it, and so I can say a little bit about how this book came to be and how it relates to the theme for me. So I do a writing group with students, or I guess it was before the pandemic that we met kind of every week. And the students I happened to be working with at that time were in various STEM fields, and they were talking about how they loved, and I have a science degree and something of a science background, and have connected with them in that way. And they were talking about how they loved sort of the aesthetics of science, and it could keep them motivated to study while also like hating being constantly tested and like struggling in the classes. So I was sort of relating to them about that. And I was talking about and thinking about and remembering how much I loved the diagrams and the concept of the metabolic pathways, where there are these components that feed into this circular system, and they generate energy, and things are taken up and converted, and what sort of a powerful and beautiful image that is. And it is circular, and it's deep in the machinery of our cells. And I started trying to write these short pieces with that little student group, where I would try to kind of enact that same motion in the space of my daily life. What does that look like, where things are being converted? And what does it look like to kind of map the energy patterns of my daily existence? So I had those, once I started having like what a chunk of that kind of poem looks like, I was calling them metabolic poems, I would return to that every morning just as a practice, just as something to try, because it was something I could keep doing. So in a ritualized fashion, I could return to that. And a question that emerged for me is how, instead of, when thinking about change processes, especially in the social justice sense, I guess, often there's a tendency to sort of stand outside the system and think of change from that position outside of things, like from this exterior gaze looking around. And I was trying to think through the shape of what it is to consider change from something which you are deeply within, as we are all within systems of oppression, as we call it. So anyway, that's how the theme connected for me. What does it look like to reach change from something you're embedded deeply within?
I have a question. Willa, there was this line in your poem about sort of the perspective of the therapist. It was the end about, for you, it's like holding a dragonfly by its wings, trying not to tear them off, which I absolutely love that line. And when I think about subversions too, I think about sort of the unconventional path of writing, of being a psychotherapist and yet putting out this book of poems. So I'm curious if you could speak to sort of how being a poet has affected your role as a therapist, and vice versa, how being a therapist has affected your role as a poet.
I would say that I had my identity as an artist way before I thought about being a psychotherapist. I would say that for many of you who I'm imagining are writers, you have to find a way to make a living. And for poets, often it's to be an academic. And I realized that I started out early doing poetry workshops with non-traditional populations. So I was working with people who had been hospitalized, and then it was in an outpatient mental health setting. They wrote poetry, wonderful stuff, and they had their wanted it to be published. And that was an example of the first, I would say, my first subversion, because the mental health center did not want them to put their last names on it because of confidentiality. And I said, this is really different. They are proud of it. They want their names on it. So we had to bring in the Civil Liberties Union, a whole business. Anyway, they got published with their names. So I can just say that that for me, it really is about the relationship. And I think that's probably how I became a therapist, because they always say that the most important thing in the therapeutic alliance is the use of self. That a person has to feel respected and valued, and that you're in that room in a particular relationship, but it is an alliance. And it's not a hierarchy. The therapist has a lot to learn from the client. So my books have always had some kind of emphasis on the inner life or emotional intelligence. But this is the first one that I really used the kind of template of, even the sections being oriented by mental health issues. Yeah.
I have another question. Jessica, I'm really curious about the book length poem component of Metabolics, and how, normally when I think of poetry, I think like each poem is its own contained thing. But that's not the choice you made in this book. So I'm just curious to kind of hear about where that comes from and what that process may have looked like for you.
Yeah. I was writing a book-length work of nonfiction at the time. So I was experimenting. I'd been writing. I'd written short poems before that, like short and self-contained poems. And then I was writing this book-length work of nonfiction. And so I think I was sort of between genres and had been used to, I was making the transition to working at a longer length. And I was really frustrated. I was so frustrated. I just felt like deeply my inadequacy. And so I was writing these things every morning on a legal pad, and I'd write one and I'd just flip it and write one and flip it. And then I had all these pieces, and I didn't feel like they did stand alone. And they certainly were of a set. And so then the task was how to sequence them in a way that made a coherent whole for the reader, and so into sections that were thematic. And then the sequencing of the sections. And then after that, I added pieces at the beginning and the end that contextualized the whole. There are some great people working in the book-length poem. The work of Craig Santos Perez in particular was really important to me as I was composing this. He works across not only the whole book, but like a series of, I think now 6 books that sort of changed my sense of what is possible in poetry. And it was, in a lot of ways, freeing to break away from the single poem that you'd work on and work on and work on, and then have the task of like how to sequence them in a coherent manuscript. But it presented some challenges also for publishing excerpts and things like that. Yeah. Craig Santos Perez. Yeah.
Anybody got any questions? Oh, yeah.
Just listening to both of you talk about your works, I'm also thinking about sort of the extra textual aspects or the sort of antecedents that inspired some of the work. So whether it's about the Oregon State Hospital or historical circumstances, or whether it's exploring the Krebs cycle and sort of responding to sort of concepts or ideas outside of the work. And how does that feel, or how does that enact itself, or affect the work as you're proceeding through it? Are there times when, you're in more full belief or connectedness with those sort of antecedents, or are there times when you're having doubt or questions about whether or not this is a worthy endeavor or something. So how's your relationship to those extra textual sort of concepts, and how does that inform the overall work?
I only partially believe in the Krebs cycle. I don't think it's real. That's actually kind of true. I mean, some people have written about this in the reviews of this book. That I have sort of a ambivalence about the enterprise of knowledge in the book that I think comes through. So there's a playfulness in my stance. I wanted to both get the science stuff factually right and also use all of my poetic license with respect to it. And I know that that is kind of a weird place to be, but I think it also reflects who. It reflects me really well. So I wanted to understand it as best I could on its own terms, and then step back and take the artist stance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really similar for me, because I think if you get I've had students in workshops who will say, but this really happened. But it doesn't work in the poem. So I think it's really about how do you dissect what, especially because a lot of what I am writing is historical. Dr. Fryer was the first psychiatrist to sort of come out as a gay person publicly at a convention. I think it was 1970. At that time, the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual the therapists use, being gay was still seen as a mental health disorder. And so I wanted to embody him. I wanted to find a way. So I did all the research I could about his actual speech and what people said about the speech and the reaction to the speech. But that's, again, I think there's a real difference between the fact that in novels, you're always writing in so many different voices. That's just normal. With poetry, I think, because of confessional poetry, people tend to think the I is the poet. So I think there's a little more controversy when you write in the voice of someone who's not yourself, even though that's what novelists do all the time, right? So it's very important to me to feel like I've researched and have a whole overview, but then I think it's like Jessica said, then it becomes my own.
Sorry. To add on to the line of questioning that you just had, how much of the back matter for you is necessary for the reader from your perspective? Do your books include footnotes or prefaces or afterwards that frame them, or do you care about that, or does that like the iceberg below?
I do have a preface in this book, and I think it's important. It's also a very it's not a straightforward preface. It's in the poet's voice, kind of. Although it's the only part of the book that's written from the first person perspective. But it does tell you, it starts with me as a science student and my experience of that, and it situates the reader in the setting. Like I live in a house on the edge of the forest. I'm a mom. I'm this, and this is, and there's a long series of statements that begin with the phrase, "What follows is this. What follows is that." So it actually was important. I thought this book was too strange and needed some context. And that's kind of unusual in books of poetry. There are some people who do it, but I believe that poets can do more when the reader has that. So it was my friend, the poet Sarah Wainscott, was like, well, why not, if this is the problem you're having, why not give it a preface? And a lot of this book has lots of sort of why not moments, like why not try this, why not try that? And the preface and afterword, there are two sections that bookend the book, and they reflect that.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think about that a lot. And I'm in two critique groups, and one of the people in one of my critique groups, he totally opposed to epigraphs and totally opposed to footnotes. And because what he says is it should only stand alone. Let them look it up if they don't know it. And so we completely are in disagreement on this subject. So I feel that, I guess with my last three books, I started having notes. And I think it would be similar to some folks who really like to go to a gallery and look at the artwork and stand there and not read the artist statement and not read even the title, because you feel like you're being influenced. So, but for me, because a lot of what I write about does have historical context, so notes are super important to me. I mean, I'd like the person to first read the poem, see how they enter it. That's my hope. That's why the notes are in the back. But I do think even an epigraph is important, because it's like the door into the room. I think it really, really helps a person to have a more full context. Like one of my poems, for example, is about a Kumari who is, I had a residency a few years ago in Kathmandu, and one of the Kumaris are women who premenstrual are seen as goddesses, living goddesses, and their feet cannot touch the ground. Once they have their period, forget it. They are done. And so the poem is called SIM Card Seller. It's imagining the life of a Kumari after she's no longer a goddess, right? So, you know, a person can just read that poem and think, that is just a bizarre story. So I think in that sense, the note is really important, because how many people are going to really understand this is a real person? You know, that I didn't just invent that person and made her this goddess. So I feel very strongly about notes.
Yeah, on that note, and we talked a little bit about it earlier, I'm interested in sort of, you know, the difference between, we talked about confessional poetry, where you're writing about your own perspective, versus persona poetry, where you're writing about the perspective of someone else. And as a person who also works in some like social work settings, and you know, sometimes I have these experiences with people where I'm like, oh man, I want to write about this person, but I also want to do so in a way that is holding that story with care, isn't sensationalizing it or glorifying it. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how to hold other people's stories with care and not kind of fall into that trap.
I think that's super important, because I think the whole nature of literary exploitation is you can be writing in a voice other than your own, and you are reinforcing stereotypes. And I think that's why there is a real concern now about who can write about who. And what gives one permission to write about a culture that's not your own? And so I do think that it's about, first of all, to have the sensitivity and respect if you're writing about someone who is not yourself, or if you are close to yourself, because obviously once it's on the page, it changes anyway. Yeah, so I think that question is something I think about a lot, because if we don't do it with respect, then it reinforces why, you know, people are banning books now. saying that this is okay to read and this isn't. You know, I really think that the respect has to be there.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah.
Is there a right way or a wrong way to read a poem? Like, for me, I'm not a big poem reader, but whenever I do read a poem, they seem so intimate. It seems like you're really hearing or reading somebody's thoughts. So for me, they always seem to, I always read them in the voice of the author. When I read them, to me, it's like the author, these are the author's thoughts. So is there a wrong way or a right way? Or maybe just a tip to keep in mind when you're reading a poem?
Thanks for being here as a new poem beginner. That's awesome. I think, we often talk to students about the difference between the author and the speaker of the poem. The author can create a voice that isn't necessarily theirs. And in fact, you can't reproduce yourself on the page necessarily, because there's so much more to me than I could ever get in any piece of literature, right? I might want to write a poem about that cloud, but the poem about that cloud could never take into account what I ate for breakfast this morning and my anxiety about where I'm going to be at 4 o'clock this afternoon, and who my parents are and who my spouse is and who my children are. You know what I mean? Like we're all so like incredibly multidimensional that anything that happens on the page is a teeny tiny slice. So it's always not us. It's never us. It's always some sort of a character, just necessarily. So I think it can be helpful to think about the creation of the spoken presence on the page. And it doesn't, if it helps you to connect that to the personhood of the author, because sometimes it does, especially with students too, once they've seen and met an author, it's like, oh, this came from a human being. And that's a really connective moment. I don't know if that's at all helpful.
I think reading a poem is if it moves you. And I think for many people, it's about reading it out loud to themselves, to hear the language. I know when I'm revising, I read my poems out loud. It's very evident to me when it's clunking, And so I think that it's part of why, I'll have, and I'm sure you've all experienced it, many people say in school, it felt like a burden, I didn't relate to this poem, it wasn't about my life. But I think there's so much that's changed in poetry, and so much respect for diversity in poetry and all kinds of lived experiences. So I think what's most important is to find the poems and the poets that speak to you. I know if it wasn't for some of the early feminist poets like, Adrienne Rich or Sylvia Plath, I probably wouldn't have been a poet, because I thought, okay, my life matters, okay, my lived experience. So I just think that that's what's most important, is don't feel like if you can't relate to it, you open a book and you say, don't put yourself down for it. Be able to just say, yeah, it doesn't resonate for me. I'm going to find poems that do.
Any other questions? I feel like that's a good one to end on, honestly. Yeah, okay, well, thank you all so much for being here. Let's hear it for our panelists today. Thank you all for being here. Enjoy the rest of the festival.